everyone, and welcome back. It's Jessalyn, and today we're going to talk about why we read and what happens when we don't. We're going to think about all the ways that the brain changes when we learn to read, and what we'll lose if we cease the process of teaching children how to read full books, and if we cease as a society the process of reading full books, even as adults. So this is going to focus a great deal on the work in Proust and the Squid, written by Marianne Wolf, who is a professor of child development at Tufts. And she speaks to the creation of what is called the reading brain. Essentially, we are not born with the processes that allow us to read. These instead must be shaped by a very difficult process that we as children, when we're taught to read, undergo. And those fundamental changes carry on with us throughout our lives and have actually led to so many of the innovations we have made as a society over the past some 10,000 years. So writing, the process of writing, which began 70,000 years ago with a few scratches on a rock, have been the single most important innovation to the human brain. And I speak of this now because I think we're entering a time where our reading education is changing, and our relationship to the written word and to art is changing. And this is due to our increasingly more digital world, and also the tendency of the information we receive to be summarized and to be instantaneous. And so when we go online and we look up a book, a lot of us are just getting the summaries of books very briefly, and we never actually read the entire book. The same goes for articles. We might read the very beginning, but very rarely ever finish them. And so today, as an English teacher, I'm going to talk about my own experience with students today, and how I teach, and how important it is to focus on developing the reading brain, particularly if we want to see our human species continue to innovate and lead the vibrant lives that we have always led. So I will speak a little bit also about children's books, particularly Miss Rumphius, which is my favorite here, when we think about the reading brain and how it engages with symbols, beginning with children identifying pictures as representations of reality. And so I think we all know, or certainly we've been told, what's happening to our brains as we focus more and more on digital media rather than long-form written media. We hear about our attention spans and the gray matter that deals with attention in the brain actually becoming smaller as we engage with these. We hear about how we are becoming multitaskers, and this actually causes our overall work to be less effective, because we are doing everything with a little bit less attention, and therefore at a lower skill than we would ahead of originally. We know about depression and the messing up of our dopamine in our brains due to this constant stream of entertainment. We know about these things. We also know about the distorted view of reality that digital media gives us, depicting a world for us that feels so real and yet simply has no relationship to the world that we live in, that there's a digital landscape and a physical landscape, and oftentimes the two are not really connected in the ways we think they are. We know about all these things, but we need to really think about how this is fundamentally changing the way we think and have thought since the advent of writing and reading, and since we learned this important skill and decided that it needed to be taught to people to help them think in their lives, to build truly free, thinking lives that brought goodness to everyone around them and to themselves. So this, to me, as an English teacher, is becoming more and more important, because as I encounter students, I find that they don't know how to read, and they don't have a vast knowledge or associations with story to pull from. One thing that I find fascinating is when I give students the opportunity to write, so much of what they'll write about are internet memes and internet meme language, because this is literally the schema that they have to pull from, right? The stuff that they've been taught online. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress recently released data for the senior class in America, in the United States, in 2024. Only one third of American seniors could not read at a basic level. Essentially, they could not identify a main passage in a text. This is despite all the educational attention paid to identifying main passages in small sections of text. And so as an English teacher, we have to wonder, why is that happening if we have put so much attention on teaching that particular skill? This was the lowest it has been since the advent of the test in 1992. So it's very clear that students are no longer able to read in the same way that they were before. What is also noticeable is the lowest bar of reading ability is getting lower, and it's the lowest it's ever been. So the educational gap is widening. And this has to do with a lot of reasons, particularly linguistically impoverished homes, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that obviously is very dangerous when we think about the media landscape that we are in. Artificial intelligence is now capable, as we know, of creating video content that looks, in all respects, real. Our students, at least 1/3 of them, will not be able to identify logical fallacies. They will not be able to identify the main points of political speeches. They won't have a kind of emotional intelligence that is developed through reading. They won't have the ability to make associations between someone else's life and their own life because of that lack of reading ability. And that's what we'll get into when we talk about the reading brain. So this is a very large problem, because these readers will have reduced empathy in a lot of ways, but also a reduced understanding of their own emotions, not only the inability to identify the truth in a piece of media. It's much larger than that, and it tends to the whole person and what is happening to us as people in the world. Okay. Now, what I have learned is that only about, let me put my glasses on really quick, because I wrote this down and I can't read it. There we go. Only 14% of young people said that they read for fun every day, while in 2012 that percentage was 27%. Still low, but it's certainly dropped. So children are essentially engaging with literature less and their phones more. In the same vein, only 64% of adults have said that they have read a book in the past year. And so as a country, we are simply not reading all that much. And we've allowed 1/3 of our population to become non-media literate, I would say. Not illiterate, but not possessing the fluency required to work in our current system. Now, the question becomes, why are these test scores so low? In 2022, this is what the National Council of Teachers of English stated, and so I'll read this as well. The time has come to decenter book reading and essay writing as the pinnacles of English language arts education, the group said. They wish to focus on media literacy, which smaller bits of text, while giving students more choice to read what interests them. Now, what's happening essentially in English classrooms is exactly what was stated there, is that we're reading fewer books in full, and students are actually reading small snippets of text. The purpose behind that is to ensure that they learn how to engage with small forms of media or shorter forms of media, and they can learn how to identify a main point and so on and so forth without taking up too much time, and this will help them encounter the format of reading tests or standardized testing, which will give one only small sections of text and ask one to respond to those sections of text in multiple choice or short answers or short essays. And so essentially it's a form of teaching to a literacy test. And so if we're teaching to that, why on earth is it that we are actually losing the ability as we go? Some of it is, of course, cell phone access, but I think that it's less than that, or that's not as important as we think. I think it's really how English is being delivered in the classroom. Many teachers are gearing away from teaching full books, and that means that children are not getting access to what it means to watch something develop over time. And that's a very, very important skill to learn. How does something develop over time? How do I watch something change? How do I experience this other world with a character? Just like we get to know people, we need to get to know books, and we need to get to know ourselves. Things in human life are not instantaneous, so why on earth should our information be? This is something that I think about often, that reading in particular requires some slowness to develop one's ability to critically think and form a relationship with writing and reading. We need to encounter larger text in order to understand how things change over time, to create a kind of relationship between our future, our present, and our past. But I think also in the classroom, our tendency to teach books, the same books, for years and years and years is problematic for students. They won't ever learn the ways in which books can comment upon the world in which they live, and they don't get the opportunity to draw those essential connections. So the same books have essentially been taught for the past 30 years. The number one most taught book in the United States is Romeo and Juliet, which I argue has less importance to the minds of the children now than ever. The next is The Great Gatsby, which I can give an argument for, and after that, The Crucible, which I cannot imagine any of my students having any interest in. After that, Macbeth, which I have been told multiple times gotten some students to stop reading entirely because they thought to themselves, this is what books are, why would I want to read this? Of Mice and Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, Night, Hamlet, Fahrenheit 451, and Frankenstein are all books that are most commonly taught. And while they are extraordinary books for their own reasons, they are such a limited view of the world as it is today. I do teach Night, and I love Night, and I always teach it. And I have taught Macbeth. I have taught The Great Gatsby. I have not taught any of the others on that list. No, I have taught Frankenstein. But these books, they're not necessarily going to allow students to have a conversation about literature today and a conversation about their lives at the moment. They don't necessarily reflect a student at this time's lived reality. And while the Illinois board released that statement saying that we should read for student interest, I do question that somewhat, because we must learn how to make things that are not interesting to us interesting. I think that's a skill that we all need to learn. But the books also need to reflect the world that we're in. And that's why I have made an effort as an English teacher to only teach full texts with smaller things as supplements, but only as supplements. And I attempt to get my students through a book a month, and this is hard for them, and at first they put up a great fight, but I always make sure that they know the books that they will actually want to read, and that is how I can get them to get through them in a month. So, for instance, I don't teach Macbeth because I know that most of my students could not read it, and I am okay with that. And I know that that is a very difficult thing to come to, but I understand that when it comes to an English classroom, the main goal for myself is not these specific testing goals, but that students love reading so that they do it more, because reading is so much a personal intellectual exercise, which we'll learn when we discuss the reading brain. So the books I teach are, some of them are here, not all of them. I teach Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, to think about human rights, genetic modification, and also just the wonderful character development and the depiction of schooling that is in here. So I teach this, and students love this book. I teach Solaris, wherever that is. That's why I've been talking about it a lot, because I'm teaching it. We actually just finished it. But I teach Solaris, which teaches us about what it is to encounter something that is truly alien, and how do we decenter ourselves in order to encounter it on its own terms. It helps us think about post-humanism, for instance, which children love to learn about. And this is the important thing that I'm starting to realize, is that in classrooms, children do want to learn the terms that help them describe now. And so history for me is starting to have a different place in education, because our now feels so divorced from history. I feel like we're at a very transformative shift, and we really need to be finding the words to describe the shift we're going to. And studying history can sometimes feel like a strange enterprise, because there's just no way to really apply it, not in the way that we're used to. And so I will reject Romeo and Juliet, perhaps, for Solaris instead, because it helps us think about copies, about seeing representations of things that aren't the actual thing, just like they experience in a digital world with, like, Baudrillard's concepts of simulacra. And we'll cover that, right? And that gives them the language, and they just light up when they're talking about it, because they can start to see, oh, this feels real to me, and it feels like it reflects my life. And they need to encounter this in full text. What some English classrooms are doing is you'll get the first few chapters of a book and the rest in summary, and they'll say, okay, analyze the first few chapters. We need to think about what is lost when we do that as educators. When I teach that one, I also teach Exit West, which I love, and it's probably somewhere here. I don't know. I love speculative fiction, and I tend to teach speculative books. I don't know where. Oh, I've been looking for this. Aurora Lay. I've been looking for this because I want to do a video on this, and I couldn't find it. And there it is. Oh, well, good news. Yeah, I wanted to do a video on this. I teach Watchmen, which is all about economization of morality. Ubik, we talk about consumerism and neoliberalism. Life of Pi, an introduction to philosophical thinking with a kind of amazing, almost children's book-alike central conflict, which is to be caught in a boat with a tiger. Right, all of these stories, Into the Wild, something that is a mystery in its way, in why a man would reject everything to go off into the wilderness with that kind of devastating ending. And the Chocolate War, which I just finished teaching, where students told me that for the first time they felt that the book reflected their lived reality. And Chocolate War is a book where the bullies win, and the bullies are not just the students but also the teachers, and that the world of this school, this Catholic school, was deeply corrupt, and no one is able to overcome that corruption because no one will speak up and defy what has always been. And so they will kind of give in to flattery, to all of these methods of manipulation, to a sense of belonging that allow injustices to perpetuate. And they said to me, this feels real, because the characters were people they recognized in the current world in which they live. These were not Romeo and Juliet. These were the people that have bullied them or have made life difficult for them. They see them there in true reality. And so for me, teaching long books that relate is very, very important. But we should get to why exactly that is. And so we'll turn to this book here, which is Proust and the Squid. If any of you are teachers, I would love to see in the comments what books you teach. And if you're not a teacher, what books you read as students that spoke to you and that you might return to again and again. For me, one was Madame Bovary. I loved it as a child, and which is a book that most teachers wouldn't even attempt, I think, today, given the state of literacy education. And that children, by the time they get to senior year, are perhaps not prepared to read such texts. I also loved Prayer for Owen Meany, and A Clockwork Orange, which is a text that I would be very difficult to teach, but is possible if one dedicates oneself to it. But yes, let's talk about this book, Proust and the Squid, and how our brains develop as they read. So, let's begin. Our brains are not naturally designed to read. They possess, however, an open architecture, which means they are capable of creating new connections and pathways in our neurons every time we learn a new skill. We essentially build on the genetic systems of the past with the intention of surpassing them. And then through this surpassing, we can improve our societies and the way that we think. Okay? So, the first sign of written language, as I said, was 70,000 years ago, with a bit of stuff lines written on a rock. This was making the realization that a symbol here could represent something else, that they could represent a physical object or something perhaps more esoteric or metaphysical. So that began this great process of innovation relating to the written word, with the culmination of the Greek alphabet, an alphabet with only a limited number of signs that would make writing and reading an easier thing to learn due to the limited number of signs that were available. It also came with another innovation, which was that the sign could represent a phonetic sound, and that the written language would actually be associated with the oral language itself. And so it wasn't symbols representing things, as in the Egyptian hieroglyphics, for instance, but rather symbols representing sound, which equated to the spoken language. And so this innovation was very, very important for the development of the reading brain. Now, with every great discovery, for instance, what I kind of blew through rather quickly. I didn't talk about like the ancient Sumerian method of teaching reading, which is shown, or the Egyptian methods of hieroglyphics, or the way that the symbols evolved into phonetics. Kind of just went from scratches on rocks to, letters equal phonetics, equal phonemes. I skipped over that. But with every great discovery, of course, there are critics, and with every great discovery, something is gained and something is lost. And the same goes for writing. In ancient Greece, it was ordinary that epics and great literature was performed orally. And students in Greece had impeccable memories and would memorize huge, massive lengths of these texts like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And writing at that time was done in a way to make memorization easier. So when you think about rhyme and you think about meter, in a lot of ways this was to make memorization a much easier process. So when we have like blank verse, that's kind of hard, but when you have or blank verse or free verse, it's hard to memorize that. But if you have something with clear like rhythm and meter, it's almost like a song. It's much easier to memorize. So like the poem I have memorized, let me see if I got it. It's Houseman. There in a field of... Oh wait, no. I'm trying to remember. See, I don't even remember. How many poems do you actually have memorized? You can see how reading has really just made the process of memorization completely redundant. Let me see if I can get it. It's Houseman. There in my dreams a field afar, in blood and smoke and shot. There in their graves my comrades are, in my grave I am not. I too was taught the trade of man, and spelt my lesson plain, but they when I forgotten ran, remembered and remain. So you can hear in that poem how much meter and how much rhyme is there, which makes it much easier to remember. I was imagining an image of the actual place that such a poem described, and I imagined it, and the words were sort of localized in it. So I was actually using a mnemonic technique to memorize, where you imagine spaces in your brain or in your mind, and then you place what you must remember in them. And so Socrates was very worried that these great memory-related techniques would be lost by the written word. And I think he's certainly correct, that when I memorize something, memorize lines in a play or memorize music, you maintain a very different relationship with it. Rather than moving forward, you're very much in the moment, traveling where the words are there. There in their graves my comrades are. I can actually see the graves in a way that if I were just reading it on the paper, I wouldn't see it. Or there in my dreams a field afar, in blood and smoke and shot. I'm literally seeing it and hearing the words themselves. It's an entirely different relationship to language in what you perceive in your mind. It's almost if the great picture of that world that I'm describing exists. And so the interior image-based world of a Greek mind, imagining these poems, these great epics, as castles in their minds, and being able to memorize by placing things in their brain is a skill that we simply don't have, because we have no need to create it. And the question becomes, well, what do we lose by losing that skill? Perhaps the vibrancy of imagination, certainly, which might transition into all kinds of things like innovation. But what do we gain is an entirely different question. Now, Socrates feared that when we began writing down, and when the Greeks began writing down with the alphabet, these great works of literature, that the oral tradition would be threatened by the written word. And Socrates had created an oral tradition around the dialogues, which essentially was a process of questions and answers, which taught students to delve deeply into every statement, everything that they heard, to discover what biases or beliefs or assumptions rested beneath them. And he thought that questioning everything was essentially the path to the virtuous life. This, of course, still resonates today, where we know that in order to truly understand something, you really must question it from every angle, and examine the biases or assumptions that you might have. And so knowledge was a very living, fluid creation, and that involved communication in the moment. It involved oral communication. And oral communication comes with so many benefits that the written word does not have, which is that you can question it and it will respond. You cannot ask a question of a written text, for instance, what Socrates might say, and the written text cannot respond. The written text is uncontrollable. The moment you write it down, it can go into a different context, and essentially it can be misinterpreted or used for nefarious purposes or purposes it wasn't intended for. It might be read by someone who is not ready to read it or does not have the intellectual background to understand it, and it might become disfigured by that. It also might mean that people assume that they learned something that they really haven't because they can read it. And I think that is the most central issue, not one of them, but a very good critique of the written word, particularly as we encounter it in summaries. You read a summary of a book, you think that you understand it. You don't, right? There's so much that you've missed. You read a summary of a chemistry principle, you think you understand it, you really don't. Just because you can speak on it does not mean you know it. Just because you read about it does not mean you know it, or if you have gotten it into your mind. And so oftentimes online we see a lot of people who believe they're experts in things they are not, and other people believe they are experts in things they are not, largely because we are developing a very what is the word I'm looking for? A simplistic understanding of things. There's a word that starts with an F that I'm thinking of that I can't remember. Shallow? That doesn't start with an F, but I can't remember. It will come to me. So he viewed words as alive, teeming, and living, and the written word would essentially be concrete and unquestionable. And in their impermanence, any written word could be mistaken for truth. So essentially anything you would see written, you would trust because it was so concrete. And it comes with a sense of legitimacy that it actually doesn't have. And I think we see that today with the written word online, is that we believe things merely because they're written down in a certain way or a certain style or a certain language. Even though they are fundamentally untrue. And the written word comes to that kind of flaw, essentially. You need to learn how to engage with the written word and understand it, just as Socrates taught his students to interrogate everything. And what I don't think he understood fully is the way in which, when we read, we actually are interrogating a text and actually creating internal dialogues. But we only develop those internal dialogues if we learn to sustain our reading over time, and we learn to engage with longer texts and stories, and we begin that learning process as soon as possible. Okay, so essentially his main beliefs were that writing in its impermanence would be mistaken for truth, that people would be okay with a superficial knowledge of something, and that they would lose their ability to memorize, that essentially the art of memorization would disappear, as evidenced by the fact that I only remember one poem. And, I think memorization is something we could all work on, perhaps. Me particularly. I don't memorize as much as I should. Okay, so that's Socrates and his problems with the written word. Some of them are legitimate, and some of them are more legitimate than ever due to the way in which we are immersed in the written word constantly, though that written word is so short and in such volume that we never fully get to engage with it. And because there's such volume of it and our ability to process it is so quick, those issues he perceived with the written word are amplified in a way that they haven't been previously. Now let's talk about what happens when you read a passage, and then we'll think about how you learn to read as a child, and how much that affects the way that you interact with information today, and what happens if as a child you do not learn to read. The first 5 years of your reading life are essential and foundational, and those occur when you actually cannot read, when your parents are reading to you. Those who are not read to start far behind in kindergarten than those who are, by almost, I think, 32 million words. So we'll talk about that in a second. But when you encounter a passage in a book, this is what is happening. And I'm going to read from Proust and the Squid now. When you read a passage, you will engage an array of mental or cognitive processes: attention, memory, visual, auditory, and linguistic processes. So essentially the act of reading in a very small level, just looking at a word and processing it, is involving so many different components of your brain. All of these have been designed by that action. Okay. Promptly, your brain's attentional and executive systems begin to plan how to read quickly while still understanding. Next, your visual system will race into action, swooping quickly across the page, forwarding its gleanings about letter shapes, word forms, and common phrases to linguistic systems awaiting the information. These systems rapidly connect subtly differentiated visual symbols with essential information about the sounds contained in words. So you can see it's so important. The great innovation of language is that a symbol can represent not just a thing, but a sound. And that is the greatest singular innovation of language itself. Which is why when we don't teach phonics, it can be very confusing to children how words work. Okay. With a single moment of conscious awareness, you applied highly automatic rules about the sounds of letters in the English writing system, and used a great many linguistic processes to do so. And so all of these are applied to the print before you. But then something else happens, and this is what's so important and why it's so important to read full books and to encounter as many books as possible. As you read, you're activating a battery of relevant language and comprehension processes that are still astounding researchers today. When you read, for instance, 200 words in a passage, your word meaning or semantic systems contributed every possible meaning of each word you read and incorporated the exact correct meaning for each word in its context. So as you are reading, you are not just reading the singular definition of the word, but rather integrating all other definitions of the word that you know. Now, the more situations you've encountered a word in, the more vibrant those associations will be. So essentially, one who has read a great deal will read a book with great more vibrancy than one who has not read much at all. Okay? So when we read a simple word like rose, you're not just thinking about the flower, but like the common meaning, but you're also thinking about less frequent associations, perhaps a product that you know that is rose-scented, or love, the symbolic meaning of the word, or a bouquet of roses you got. All of these different associations are coming to you, which is what gives books their layers and meaning. Okay. So it stimulates within you the trove of knowledge you possess that you rarely access. And so when you read a book, you're essentially bringing up all of these knowledge that you have gained over the course of your life that you might not ever think of or have words for or express verbally, but is contained within you. Okay? So the richness of this semantic dimension of reading, of this just word and definition based part of reading, depends on the reading you have already done. Okay? So what that means is when you read a text, you are not just reading the text, you're actually going beyond the text and adding your own interpretations to it without even really noticing that you're doing it. And that's what makes reading in the reading brain so important, is that process of putting on all of these different definitions of words and therefore different concepts. Okay? So we are shaped not just by essentially the way we read, but we're shaped by what we read. And the more reading we do, the more we have to pull from. Okay? So Proust believed that reading gave us access to innumerable worlds capable of transforming our intellect. So the more you read, the more that you could experience on a daily basis, and the more layers you would see to life. The less you read, the flatter experience it would be, and the less associations you would have with words themselves. So John Donne thought that the boundaries of the self were tested by the process of, quote, passing over. So when the reader reads, they are essentially passing over the mind of another and remembering that and bringing it to life in future situations. So each time we enter into another perspective, for instance, I read the poem "In My Grave I Am Not," I am seeing in my mind the depiction of a field that I know, right? And I am thinking about the way the words sound to me. I'm imagining actually the moment that I memorized it, the moment that I learned it, the moment in which it became important to me, and why. So I think back to college when I first encountered the poem and fell in love with it. And so there's so many layers to this written object. Also, I think about when I taught it in college, and when students didn't understand it, because the definition of dream was not the definition that they were thinking of. And so when you think about these students I was teaching that didn't read much, I gave them in my dreams a field afar, in blood and smoke and shot. And for some reason, these students thought this must be about a guy thinking about what he wants to be, what he wants to become, which is a complete misunderstanding of the poem. And yet in their media world, they only ever encountered dream as you dream to be something, you dream to do something. It was forward thinking. It was never reflective. Okay? Forward thinking dream, not reflective thinking dream. No one, not a single person in that class, had an association with dreaming about the past, only dreaming about the future. And due to that one word, they completely misread the poem. And so the fact that they had not read books that reflected on dreams meant that they did not really understand how to reflect on dreams in the way that Haussmann wished them to. So that is just a small moment in which they did not have the associations with the word that they needed to really read the poem. And we had to really sit down as a class and talk about why it was that everyone misread that poem, which I considered rather simple, not having any complex words in it. But even the most simplest of words have associations that are particular to each reader. Okay. So when you have this moment where you're encountering all these different words as you read, what you're essentially doing neurologically is reorganizing your brain in new and brilliant ways. It's kind of like creating like a new solar system from all the elements provided in the universe. Each time you read, you're forming these new associations, and you're engaging your brain in new ways. Now that allows us to go beyond the text and create something new. And so you might find that your most creative moments are actually after reading, because it allows prompts and actually teaches innovation. So that opportunity to go beyond the neurological structure of our brain, to take it and utilize it and to rebuild it essentially for new and to surpass its limits, also applies to what we can do with our own lives that will help us navigate our reality while also creating new opportunities. So the world we have created now with all of this technology and innovation is created by the reading brain. The irony is that by creating this with the reading brain, we are actually stopping new reading brains from being created, and innovation will pass out of our hands and into the hand of the machine we have created if we don't make an effort to maintain the human's relationship to reading, and the passing over that John Donne speaks of. Okay. Now let's think about how we come to learn to read as children, because this is when all of the most important processes really happen. For the most part, we learn to read as children in the United States. Certainly there are exceptions to this rule, like students who perhaps had dyslexia and were not properly taught through all the techniques we have to teach children with dyslexia. Or if you had other learning disabilities, then you might have not learned to read as a child and may have learned later. But learning to read begins the moment an infant hears a story for the first time. The moment. So you might read to your child when they're 3 days old. You don't really understand how becoming acquainted with those sounds happens immediately. So the act of reading to a baby in the first 5 years of life is actually the best predictor of future reading skills. And in kindergarten, a gap of 32 million words already separates some children in what are referred to as linguistically impoverished homes. So, homes at the lowest economic scale will have no children's books in them at all. In the lower to middle class, there tend to be about 3 children's books per home, but in a well-off upper class household, there are about 200 children's books. So children in these impoverished homes will not actually ever see, oftentimes, a book in the first 5 years of life unless they're going to some sort of program where they're receiving a reading education. That will create that gap of 32 million words when they walk into kindergarten. So that means, as we know, that when they read a book, they don't have all those associations already when they, get to know the books that one reads in kindergarten. I don't actually know what one reads in kindergarten, but Amelia Bedelia, perhaps. A student who comes to read Amelia Bedelia that has never encountered a book at home will not have the kind of associations and schematas to read that particular book. The schemata is very important because it helps children begin to notice qualities specific to very certain types of stories. And that's important because they can then notice those qualities and they can use them to predict what will happen in stories in the future. So these schematas help them navigate texts, and so they can predict what occurs based on their previous reading. A student that does not have that previous reading cannot predict what occurs. Simultaneous or at the same time, an adult who does not have developed schemas or schematas related to the reading they have done will not be able to predict, for instance, human behavior in the world. And so when we think about, okay, 1/3 of our population can't read on a basic level. What that also means is 1/3 of our population doesn't have the schemata that this reading brings us. So it's much more severe, I think, than just you can't identify the main point of a passage. It literally means you can't predict future behavior as well as someone who does read. You can't illuminate all the different times that something has been like this, like another reader can. And so you're very much caught in a present without being able to move forward or back, which is, of course, dangerous. For you can be convinced of things that simply aren't true, as Socrates worried. So children begin to identify story types and use those types to predict other stories and to create their own stories. Reading will get children to imagine. And they also begin to associate reading with love. And this is the fun one, that when you read to a child, they are sitting right in a parent's lap, and they will associate that act of reading and being read to with the love of a parent. And so that sense of love that you have as a child actually stays with you for most of your life. If you're read to as a child, you likely have a better relationship to reading than you would if you hadn't. So you might find that you love reading because it enacts those feelings of love. Okay? But what is most fascinating to me about reading and the nature of writing, and it's somewhat imperfections, is how it engages our brains in those associations. Now, children's books are very different because children's books, as you can see, they have words written on the page aligned with images. And that's what makes them so fascinating. Let me back up a little so you can see the book. Miss Rumphius is my favorite children's book. It's all about how to make the world more beautiful. And when I look at it, I really do see scenes from my past. So it gives me hope, because I grew up in a kind of I didn't grow up, but I lived in a mill town like this. And I found it so beautiful. And this picture is an imperfect representation of that mill town. Okay? Imperfect. It emphasizes certain aspects of that mill town, particularly the smoke rising from chimneys. A picture of this mill town, well, it wouldn't get that, right? And it shows me the little sailboats in the distance, which in the winter wouldn't be there, right? Well, at least it wouldn't have been in my little mill town. And you see the beautiful big words, flour and grain, right there. I don't know if you can see them. Flour and grain, Eagle Hotel, carving and painting. All of these words and the smoke rising. So it really does emphasize the beauty of these little mill towns. There's none of the dirty or the icky, right? And so when that picture is imperfect like this, it emphasizes certain aspects that are designed to make you feel certain emotions. For this, it makes me feel nostalgia for that beautiful world. It makes me feel awe, because there's a little girl staring out. And I would look at this little girl and I would see myself holding onto the railing looking out. And so children are beginning to associate pictures with emotions, just as pictures are always intended to show. And so they look at this and they feel, and so they'll begin to experience feelings that they wouldn't ordinarily experience in a completely no-stakes environment. So you're practicing feeling. So reading is actually teaching you emotional intelligence. And it's the same for adults. When we read books, we are practicing feeling in certain situations, watching as other characters experience something. And we experience it with them. Again, it's the practicing of feeling and the development of emotional intelligence. If you do not read, you never really gain the ability, or you lose out on that capacity to practice your emotions. And that's why it's so important to read these long-scale books. You don't get that kind of emotion from the quick media you see online because A, it's too quick. You don't have the time to really contemplate it. And B, oftentimes this media is a perfect representation of something. It's not an artistic representation of something. The composites that you get in art, right, imperfect representations, require the brain to look at it in a new way and fill in and create a new image from it. This is what's fascinating about art. When you look at art, it's not a perfect representation, so it doesn't allow your brain to be lazy, right, and to look at it as like any ordinary thing in reality. It's essentially a little problem for your mind. And so when you encounter a picture like this, you have to do some intellectual work to make sense of it, and some intellectual feeling to make sense of it. Something like this is not a perfect representation of reality, and yet the light creates warmth. The image of sitting on a father's lap creates a sense of love, and there's a beauty and a closeness to it, right? And the little cat, the composite of a cat, right? It all creates something whimsical and dreamlike. And at the same time as you read to, children would begin to associate these little objects on the page, because that's all they are, with the sounds of the parent's voice, and with meaning, and also with the picture alongside it. So they begin to make those associations. So you're learning, essentially as children, to experience emotion, to be loved, what it feels like to be loved, and also how to engage with an author to create one's own thoughts. So I'll just show you this picture. It's not a great format to show a children's book. But that's what this book teaches you, right? It teaches important lessons that then as adults you can go back to, right? It's another good thing about books that we can't do with little Instagram reels or TikTok. TikTok has this absolutely infuriating ad out right now. I think I just saw it on a football game saying that TikTok teaches. TikTok doesn't teach, right? Teaching is an extended process of interrogation and experience and communication and engagement. And it takes time, and that's the most essential thing. It takes so much time. And so in this book, I can watch a woman go from child to old woman. I see a life unfold. I can't see that in a tiny video. I see what it's like to plan life, to live it, to experience its adventure, and then to leave some gift behind, right? That's what I get to see as a child when I read this book. And Miss Rumphius is all about leaving the world more beautiful than you find it somehow. For her, it's planting lupines. She's a lupine lady. She goes around and she plants lupines. And in this particular time period where I think we're faced with rapid change, thinking about what the one thing you can do to make the world beautiful is a rather beautiful sentiment. And I guess in my way, these little videos are a way to do that. Just to think, oh, this is a beautiful thing. Here's how to experience it, and let it be what you wish it to be. But that is how we learn to read, right? We learn to fill in the gaps of art and of writing and reading. And so perfect representations that AI might create, right? Artificial intelligence can create literally real people that look real. We don't engage with them in the same way as we do with art. And the immediacy of the availability of information keeps us from going through the processes of bringing up our own intellectual associations. It keeps us from going through the difficult process of actually rewiring our brain to learn. We're not doing that anymore when we learn so instantaneously. We're superficially learning, as Socrates would say. And that is something that we need to be very careful about, lest we make the mistake of eradicating that which brought us this world. Because then how on earth will we maintain it? And how will we innovate it? We don't want to put the innovation in the hands of something that is not us. And I think that is so important. We don't want some AI brain to be innovating instead of us. At least I don't. We might, for instance, perhaps gain from that rapidity of processing, that this AI brain essentially can process so much faster than we can. But speed is not always a benefit. Our brains actually have delay neurons or delay processes to slow down the uptake of information so we can sequence it properly and we can understand it. Our brains actually understand the value of slowing down. And so in this way, that could be an argument against accelerationism, which we see now, which is the desire to develop as quickly as possible and see what happens after. Well, what we lose, I think, is a vibrancy of the human condition, of the human experience, because we will not get the opportunity to innovate in our own lives if we no longer read. So my advice is go and get a book. If you want to learn more, this is the book, right? Proust and the Squid is a great rumination on brain science and how we learn. Proust being everything that happens with our associations and our memories and going beyond the text, and the Squid being the way in which our brains have neurologically changed based on the process of reading. But read a book. Read to your children. I think that is the biggest thing. Read to your children as much as you can if you have them. Because it will be the best thing you can do for their brains and the development of their critical thinking capacity. So much of that happens with you and not with a teacher in English in school. So read yourself, read to your children, and take time to learn things, right? To investigate, to determine for yourself. And don't let something just instantaneously give you the answer, because you don't even know if that answer is right, and oftentimes it isn't. Okay, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful night, and please subscribe if this interested you. All right, bye everyone, good night.